Hi, my name's Erin. I am from Neal Campus Kingman in Mojave Community College, and today we are going to talk about how do we read a research article. So hopefully at the end of this session, you will be able to identify the parts of a research article. You'll be able to define peer review as it relates to research articles, and you'll have a good system that you can use when reading research articles. And the reason that we want to kind of move towards a system when we're reading a research article is because research articles are very different than other things that we read. Magazines, newspapers, these things are very easy to read in one sitting and to just kind of go through from start to finish, not have to put a lot of extra time into understanding what is going on. But in a research article, there's a lot of different parts. There's a lot of unique language, and we have to read strategically. So the first thing we need to understand is what are these parts of a research article? This is one of the easiest ways to identify whether you actually have a research article or not. If you have one, you will most likely have these certain parts: introduction, methods, results, and discussion, and generally in this order. Research articles, they are published in academic journals. But academic journals don't only have research articles. They also have letter to the editors. They have book reviews. They might have kind of like humor pieces, funny insights into that specific field. So not everything in that journal is going to be a research article. So if you really need one of these research articles for your assignment or for your own personal reference, make sure that it has these four components, okay? So what do these four components do? The introduction, this is where the researcher is going to kind of give you a broad idea of what is going on and why they decided to actually go into this, at times, very lengthy study. Often this is where the literature review is included. A literature review is where the researcher kind of lays out everything that they've read, because they don't just arrive at these questions out of thin air. They read academic journals, they talk to their colleagues, they come up with questions from previous research, and they always take the time to read what is out there before they actually start in on their own experiment. So sometimes the literature review is identified by heading, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just woven into the introduction. But the literature review is really important. So first off, you can understand where the researcher is coming from, but also if you need some other articles to support your ideas, this is a great place to find easy sources. You can just backtrack and use some of the researchers' research, basically, that they did for their article. Okay, the methods. This is how the experiment or the research was actually done. This is where the team is going to lay out exactly how they did it and what they accomplished. And then the results, this is where they analyze their data. It can be really technical, it can be really trying to understand, but it's very important to try your best to wade through that and get to the heart of it. Finally, the discussion, sometimes called the conclusion. This is where the researchers, they might talk a little bit more about their results, but really what they're going to do in this section is apply it to either future research or the world at large, sometimes both. So they might have this very narrow question, and then they're going to try to take their results from that super narrow question and kind of apply it to a broader sense. So peer review. Many research articles that you will read in college are peer-reviewed, and what this is a process to vet articles. And what happens is a researcher, or more generally a research team, usually maybe 5 to 7 people average, they do their experiment or they do their research, and then they want to publish it so other people can read about it. And the first thing they do is send their article to the academic journal's editor. Now, the editor, they can either reject it outright. This is very common. A lot of publications have a very small percentage of submissions that they actually will publish. So the editor might reject it, or the editor might think it's worthy of publishing, and then they might ask for some revisions. But eventually, if they think it's good to go on to the next level, they're going to send it to other experts. And these experts are going to pretty much do the same thing that the editor did. They're going to look for gaps in the research. They're going to decide, is this important, that people need to know about this, that it's important to take up space in our journal. And once the experts or the peer reviewers are satisfied, then they're going to send more revisions to the research team. But eventually they're going to tell the editor, yeah, this looks good, let's publish it. Everybody's happy, then it actually makes it into that academic journal. So it's a very long process, very rigorous process. And it's important to us as students because when we get peer-reviewed articles, it comes with a little bit more of a guarantee that the research is ethical, that it's credible, that we can trust it, basically. And we always need to be thinking critically about what we're reading, but this is a way that we can kind of quickly identify what we want to spend our time critically thinking about. And sometimes your instructors are going to require that you use this type of research, so it's very important to read your assignment closely, and if you need to use peer-reviewed articles, make sure that they are peer-reviewed. All right, so before we begin, the first thing we want to do is read the title of the article very carefully because, as you can see, we're going to use the same article throughout this presentation. But as you can see, these titles can be a lot. They can be several sentences, well, several lines long, and contain a lot of unique jargon, a lot of specialized language. So sometimes you might even have to do research on just what some of the words in the title mean. In science and this one is from psychology or psychiatry. In disciplines, there's very specific meaning for words. So even though we might, as laymen, understand what emotion is, to a researcher who's looking at things on a whole nother level, emotion has a very specific definition. So just looking at this title, I feel that I might have to look up, what is emotion dysregulation? Do I feel like this article is going to meet my needs as a student writing a paper, or do I need to just kind of pass it over based just on the title? So take a little time to read the title. It can save you time in the long run if it actually doesn't help you. Next, we want to look at the authors. In a scientific paper, the first author, so in this case it would be Kim L. Gratz, the first author is the person that is most responsible for the article. They did the most work and they had the most responsibility. Then it basically goes down in responsibility from there. So Matthew T. Toll in this example, he might have just been a distant advisor. He might have just been in that department. It's hard to know, but it's really important to understand that, because what we want to do is then research the authors themselves. We want to go on to Google and type in their names, see, are they currently teaching? Have they ever been part of a scandal? Where did they get their degree? What is their actual field of study? Because sometimes it's very strange. Sometimes you'll get these articles that, for example, maybe they are about psychiatry, but the person writing it is a business professional. They have a master's in business or something like that. And as students, we want to kind of just take that into consideration and think, do they really have expert status in this field to be able to write this article? So when we look at the authors, we also want to look at their institutional affiliations. Most research comes out of universities, but not always. Sometimes it's government organizations. Sometimes it is corporations. Sometimes it's nonprofit organizations. So what we want to do then is look at what do these institutions do in the world? What is their agenda? What do other people think about them? And, in research, unfortunately, a lot of times money can play into what's published. It can play into what results are found. So as readers, we want to know, where's the money coming from and how is it being used? And is there a chance that could be influencing our researchers to, I hate to say, like, unethical, but we want to make sure our researchers remain neutral and have a good standing. The other thing, this kind of ties into what I was just talking about. We want to look for disclaimers and disclosures of funding and support because, again, research doesn't take place in a vacuum. It has to be funded by some kind of money. So, for example, this researcher was funded by a grant from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Now, my guess, just from looking at this title, and I haven't researched this grant, my guess is that this National Institute, their goal is to prevent people from using illicit drugs. But, can a bias come out of that? Could they overlook maybe benefits of certain types of drugs? And we want to just kind of take that into consideration when we are reading the article. We always want to look at the publication date of the article. Some of your instructors will say nothing older than 5 years. Some of your instructors won't. Sometimes it's appropriate to use an article from 1915, and sometimes it's not. So it really depends on what you're writing about, what your assignment guidelines are, and what you need. So this one written in 2017, very recent. We want to look at the journal. Because journals have their own reputations. Some journals, they might have a title that makes them sound like they're peer-reviewed, but they actually aren't. And some journals might sound legitimate, but actually they are shells for corporations to publish bad research articles. A lot of times this is where those free articles are coming out of. So, we want to just make sure that this is a credible journal, that they're not publishing a lot of garbage, basically, or stuff that's just convincing us to buy a product. So now we are ready to kind of get into the meat of the article. You can always kind of get a quick idea of what it's about by looking at the major subjects. So, for example, if I was writing a paper on anxiety disorders, this article is about borderline personality disorder, probably would not help me. So I could skip it over. But if I am writing about borderline personality disorder, seeing this in the major subject area would tell me that there's probably something in here I can use for my paper. Next, we want to just kind of skim through, look at the headings and subheadings, and then any words that pop out, you definitely want to take note of that. And you always want to read and write down every word that you don't understand and research those words, because again, the words mean very specific things. Even things like significant versus non-significant in research, very, very specific meaning to those words. There's nothing subjective about it. So as you read, just write down the words you don't understand. And sometimes some of these articles, they don't make it easy on you. So it might be a lot of words. That's okay. Reading research articles is a skill that you will build over time. It's not something that comes easy, and it's not something that comes quickly. So if you feel like you're totally lost at first, don't beat yourself up. Just give yourself a little slack and realize it's going to take time and extra work. Sometimes you can use a regular dictionary, but sometimes you have to look in other places like discipline-specific dictionaries or encyclopedias. You might even ask your instructor if it's their specialty, because not every word is going to be found in just your regular Webster's dictionary. Sometimes you even have to read an entire other article in order to understand one word. So it really just depends on what's going on in your article. Okay. So the introduction, we kind of covered this before, that it's very broad and it kind of lays out the scenario that the researchers are going to delve deeper into, because research is very narrowly focused, but obviously has to start from some kind of broad picture. The introduction is not the first thing that's presented in an article. The first thing presented in an article after the author's names and stuff like that is the abstract. So the abstract is written by the authors, and a lot of times it can be very biased. It's a summary of everything in that article, but the authors are going to want to make the article sound exactly how they, like very flawless and perfect, basically. Not always. Sometimes they're very honest in their abstract, but it can be a little biased. So we always want to just skip right over the abstract at first and start reading with the introduction. because as we're going through this article, our goal is to always make up our own mind by critically thinking about what's going on and asking a lot of questions. We don't want to be swayed by the researchers right off the bat. So as we're reading the introduction, we want to identify what's called the big question. And the big question, oh, we have someone joining us. I hope you can hear me okay. All right, so we're just gonna minimize you here. And if you have, if you have any questions, feel free to type it into the chat box. And I'll keep it up on my screen. Hopefully it won't cover any material. So we have talked about the different parts of the article, and we've talked about some things that we're going to need to do before we actually start reading. Now we are getting into the systematic process of reading the research article. So we're talking about the big question. And again, the big question is, what is the field as a whole trying to solve? It's not what the researchers themselves are trying to solve. So in terms of this article, they might want to say, you know, how does borderline personality disorder affect physical health problems? Or well, even bigger than that would probably be, why do some people have borderline personality disorder? So that's a very large question. All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Any questions so far?
No.
Okay, awesome. All right. So our next step is to summarize the background. And again, the background can be often thought of as a literature review. So we want to make sure that we understand what the authors are summarizing for us. So you just try to take all of that, and sometimes it can be 1 to 3 pages of literature review. It really just depends. We want to kind of condense that as much as possible and try to pick out those key points. And some questions to guide you: what work has been done before, because a lot of times the work that is done before is going to shape the current research that's being done. What are the limitations? The author should point out limitations of either prior research. A lot of times limitations is what generates research questions, like, oh, they weren't able to do that, but maybe I can figure that out. And then also, what do we need to do next as a field, or what do we need to do next as a research question?
Oh, is that a question for me?
Oh, me? No, we're good.
Okay.
Okay. So we've identified the big question. We have summarized the background information. And then the next thing we want to do is identify the specific question. A lot of times it is the hypothesis. So this is the very narrow focus of what the researchers are going after. Most of the time they will just state it very plainly. Sometimes they'll even break it out into a separate paragraph and will just be labeled hypothesis or purpose, something like that. In the article that we're using, they are saying that borderline personality disorder predicts that there's going to be physical health symptoms later on in those individuals. So that's what they are actually going to test in their research. And then we need to know, how are the authors going to figure out how to answer that question? So they should tell you their approach. They should tell you their sample size. They should tell you how they are going to get their sample. They should tell you what types of experiments, if they're going to do it, of any, in the hard sciences, are they going to apply any kind of specific measures or something like that to their sample. Okay, so the methods, we're going to break it down even more detail. So again, this is where they're going to tell you exactly who is in their study and how they got those people. And then also they're going to list their variables. At minimum, we'll have two variables. The control variable is what's going to stay the same, and then the experimental is going to be what the researchers are trying to measure, what they're trying to find out if it impacts anything else. So method sections, especially in the hard sciences, can be really difficult to understand. They are going to have certain processes, like some of the biology articles or chemistry articles. They're going to list a lot of different equipment or chemicals, things like that. As students, we don't really need to understand everything that's going on, because our goal isn't really to reproduce at this stage in our education, is not to reproduce this experiment. We just need to understand the basics and enough to realize, try to find holes in where the researchers may or may not have gone wrong or what we can do in the future. So size of study can be really important. Sigmund Freud, very prolific person in psychology, gets a lot of flack because really his sample size was 12 Austrian women, and he tried to apply that to mankind or humankind as a whole. So just thinking about Freud's sample size and kind of applying that to what are our researchers doing today, can we find places where they had just a really tiny sample size and then tried to make it sound more important than maybe it actually was. Also, how long did they collect the data? Sometimes researchers might spend, up to 10 years collecting data on the same subjects. Or, did the subjects all come from a very small geographic area? There are pockets around the country that have just these random illnesses that seem to break out. Did the researchers just focus on that one little pocket where everything was very magnified? Or did they try to look across the country and take a good sample size that might be representative of the entire US? Then how do they gather the data? Humans, if you're using human subjects, a lot of times they're not very truthful. So how did they make sure that they were getting good answers, that people weren't just outright lying? How did they make sure that people actually answered their surveys? Sending out a mailer, a lot of times those get tossed, things like that. Did they count on people to self-report that they were taking their medicine, or did they actually observe them taking their medicine? So all this is very important, and it really comes into exactly what the researchers are trying to measure. So we want to look at that and figure out how did they actually get their numbers. This kind of feeds into what I talked about before. How did they get these subjects? Was their sample diverse enough to support their opinion? And then it's really important to note who was excluded. Is there a real reason why a certain subject or a certain demographic was excluded? How they were invited to participate can be important too. It's really common for people to get paid for their time, so we shouldn't be too alarmed by that, but we definitely want to just kind of look at how did they actually come about selecting these people. Okay, so once we've read through the methods section, we want to just draw a diagram that makes sense to us. This is a screen cap from the article that this presentation is based on. This obviously makes no sense to me or probably to any of us, but to the person that read the article, this flow chart really helps them understand what is happening. You can draw pictures, you can just write, but you want to have some kind of chart. It just helps you to really understand what's happening in the article, to go through that physical act of writing it out. And then we want to think critically. We always want to question the researchers. Yes, they're experts, but they're also humans. They have biases, they make mistakes, they might not see all the possibilities. So we want to ask these questions as we read. Do you feel that they chose the right subjects? Were they measuring the right variables? And does everything make sense? Are there any gaps that could cause error or cause results to be inflated for significance? So we're always critically evaluating what we're reading. So we are now into the results section. And the results a lot of times are very intimidating because in certain disciplines, there might be a lot of charts with a lot of numbers that don't quite make sense to us. But we want to do our best to understand the data that's in these charts. The researchers spend a lot of time making these diagrams for us. It's not just to make things more interesting. They are trying to convey very important information here. So again, we want to physically write out what we're reading after we've read it, just a brief summary. Again, you need to pay attention to those words like significant or non-significant because they mean very specific things in research, very objective things in research. Sometimes the researchers won't include all the data in the published article because there might be a ton of it. And sometimes they might be trying to skew it one way or another. So a lot of times you can find that data online, especially if they work for a government agency or something like that. Not always, but it's always worth a look. And you want to look at what statistical models they used because not all statistical models are equal. Some are much more rigorous than other ones. So you don't have to understand how to actually do the math. You just need to see the pros and cons. So you might look up the pros and cons of each model and see, how easy is it to skew data. Charts, they will often have error bars. They will also have footnotes, and one might be about the sample size. So in the beginning, they told you, we selected 180 participants, but then if the chart is only showing data for 86 participants, what happened to those other people? Did they drop out? Did they give false information that it was discovered? Sometimes did they die? It happens in research. So if there's a discrepancy in that sample size, we want to know why that is. If the researcher doesn't explain that, that's a pretty big red flag. So now we want to take our summary of the results and apply that to the hypothesis. Does it actually answer the question? And we want to do that before we move on to the author's discussion of the conclusion. Again, these are experts, but they are human. So even if you end up changing your mind at the end, if you can read critically throughout the article and make up your own interpretation, not only is that good to avoid being swayed by people, but you will be actively engaged in the article and you'll get a lot more out of it, and you'll probably have to read it fewer times. Okay, so the discussion. Sometimes called the conclusion or interpretation, it really just depends, but it has some really key points that will let you know, hey, this is the end or the discussion. And they are going to talk about how does their experiment go back and support the hypothesis and then support kind of what the field as a whole is trying to do. Another thing they're going to do is kind of dig back into that literature review in the introduction and compare what they found to what those other researchers found. It's a very popular thing to do, especially if there's any discrepancies. They want to note that and then discuss why that might have been. And then a really important thing for the discussion is talking about future research. Research is never done. There's always another question that comes out of an experiment or a survey, and the authors should spend a lot of time thinking about what they can do in the future to answer any questions that arose during their study. Again, we always want to write a summary, just paraphrase what we have read, and then match it to what we thought before we read this section. And we also want to look for bias. As I mentioned earlier, certain grants are funded by certain institutions with certain goals and ideals. Nonprofit organizations, they have missions. And bias is an inescapable part of being a human being, but we want to be able to look for that and identify that and then think about it critically and how it feeds into that research as a whole. Okay, so we've talked about each part, and then the strategies on how to approach each part. This section, we're just going to talk about what can we do as a whole when we read. And we always want to read, even when we're talking about textbooks or class notes, anything, not just research articles. We want to read actively and read critically. And really the best way to do that is to just continually ask yourself questions as you're reading. Oh, what if, the researcher is saying it's this way, but what if it was this way? Maybe the researcher didn't fully answer that question. I wonder what they're not mentioning. And just going through and asking yourself questions like that, you'll remain engaged in the reading process. Because if you read 3 pages passively, just kind of skimming through the text, you're not going to remember anything and you're not going to understand what's happening. Again, we never want to assume that the authors are correct. Because people are human, make mistakes, have biases. Things can look really legitimate and actually be research articles that have been purchased by corporations to try to sell you a product like, hey, drinking more coffee will help you live longer, or eating chocolate every day is good for you. There's a lot of research articles that were purchased by chocolate and coffee corporations to try to sell you products. People also can feel very pressured to deliver results or to advance their own agenda. So they might falsify data. It happens. A research article written today might be found to be debunked 5 years later. So we always want to just practice critical reading skills. You can see a screenshot here. A lot of articles that have been retracted, which means that they're considered no longer valid. A lot of times they will say retracted, either in the title or across in a watermark. And if we come across one article that's retracted, we definitely want to research those authors very closely and make sure that maybe there are other articles. If they are also retracted, we want to avoid those. So this is a summary of what we've talked about. At first, we always want to find out who those authors are and where the money's coming from, because if the money is coming from a source that's just trying to sell us something, we don't want to waste time reading that article. Then we skip that abstract because it can be written in a very biased way and go right to the introduction. We identify the big question, what is this field as a whole trying to answer? Then we identify the specific question, what is the research team going to try to answer in their experiment? How did they do their experiment? We're looking up words we don't understand. And then we are summarizing the methods, results, and then the discussion. Once we've done all that, we're going to go back and read the abstract and see, does the abstract really match what's happened in this paper? And do I agree with the results that are presented in that summary? So just another kind of infographic. If you're more of a visual learner, how does that happen? Oops, let me move this real quick. So again, we always want to read actively, take notes, and then summarize in our own words. Putting things in our own words not only helps us understand and make sure that we actually understand what we're reading, but it shows your instructor that you understand. Because again, these articles are very difficult to read. The researchers don't make it easy on us. There's a lot of technical language, a lot of jargon, and then on top of that, a lot of them write with very complicated sentence structure. They use $10 words. So as students trying to break into reading these, it's very difficult. And if we can show our instructors that we actually understand what we've read, then we are going to be so far ahead of the game. So at the library, we're always here to help you research articles, find articles. We can help you kind of go through this process, and maybe you need to do some extra background research. We can help you with that. We can do these Zoom video chat sessions one-on-one. You can set up appointments with us, email us, call us, things like that. So we're always here to help you guys. And then I want to show you an article, and we'll kind of point out some of the things that we went over. Okay. Any questions on anything that we talked about?
No.
Okay. Okay, so this is, I like this article a lot. It's a very simple article, but it's a good example how to get started. So you can see the article, right? Use of a dog visitation program.
Yes.
Okay, great. So if we were going to start out using, deciding whether we wanted to use this article for research, this title is pretty straightforward. So wouldn't take a lot of time if you had to look some words up, but I doubt anybody would. These are our authors right down here, and we definitely would want to research our authors. So every article, unfortunately, can be laid out a little differently. This article, they do say where the authors are from down here at the bottom. So they list the author affiliations and who they apply to. And they declare no conflicts of interest, which, you know, it's great that they declare that. We always want to kind of dig more into that. We don't want to take it at face value. And then they also leave a mailing address, which is nice too. And then also, when I researched this person, Penelope Stevens, I couldn't find a lot of stuff, but then a lot of stuff did pop up with Penny Stevens. So having this extra information here did make it easier to find out who exactly Dr. Stevens was. So this article, they have the abstract separated in a box. A lot of times it's not separated quite so dramatically. It might be just indented a little more, it might be in a little smaller text at the top of the page. But we're going to skip the abstract. We notice these keywords, not a whole lot, but if I was writing about animal therapy, I would know that this article would definitely have what I wanted. So this is where the introduction starts, and their literature review is folded into the introduction. You can see a lot of citations starting around the top of the page here. That's a hint that you're into that literature review. So they have it's about a page, I guess, well, maybe a page and a half of literature review and introduction. And then they are going to put their specific question right out here using the word purpose. So, you know, they want to find out whether having a dog visit trauma patients in the hospital will improve scores on a survey about physician care. Very, very narrow question. Their bigger question is, you know, how can we improve trauma patients' experience in the hospital? So they're going to outline their methods. This right here, a quasi-experimental study. Quasi-experimental means something very specific, so we would want to look that up and find out what exactly that means, because it's a specific type of experiment or experimental model. So here they're going to outline where they got their sample from. So they are using a certain hospital, and then they also, let's see, there's a part in here where they say they do it in the summer because that's a busy time of year. So right off the bat, as readers, we can understand from that they went into this without a firm sample size number because their experiment depends on people getting injured, which you can't really predict, can't pinpoint an exact number of how many people are going to come into your hospital. That they pick summer because at least they know they're going to get some kind of sample. They tell you that the people included in the study have to be over the age of 18. They have to speak English. They have to provide consent, verbal consent, and be in private rooms. And then they also tell you who is excluded. Very important. People with a fear of dogs were excluded for a reason. Those people will respond very negatively on a survey if they're introduced to this dog that they don't want to be around. So the researchers have very good reasons for the exclusions, and they present them here. Oh, here we go. Here's our summer part. They also talk about the dog and the handler, and then they say that the visits were not scripted. So again, as readers, we can ask ourselves, if they don't tell the handler exactly what to say and how long to be in the room, can that influence how people are going to respond on the survey? If the handler doesn't pick up on the fact that they need to leave and they've overstayed their welcome, is the person then going to respond negatively? So just questions that we ask ourselves as we read. So they then talk about how they collected their data, which they used a survey. They talk about when they administered the survey. That's really important. If you administer it 5 minutes after they visited, or in this case, 72 hours after, it can be a big difference between the results that you're going to get, or the answers that you're going to get. Then they're going to talk about their results. So they ended up with a sample size of 150 patients, and 83 people were put into the dog visitation group and 67 were in the control group. So our control group, they didn't have any interaction with the dog. It was just business as usual for them. But both of these are filling out the survey. Then they tell you the makeup, 18 to 93 years old, and then 61% were male. Here they say no statistically significant difference between the groups related to age and gender. So again, statistically significant, very specific, meaning that we would want to look up and research when we got to this point in the article. Okay, so then they say they used a Mann-Whitney U-test. So this is a statistical model that they applied to their data, and it has its pros and cons. And as readers, we want to stop and take a moment to research that and find out how rigorous it is or how rigorous it isn't. And then they're going to break it down they have 5 questions on their surveys. They break it down and give you the results for each one. And in that Mann-Whitney U-test, these letters and numbers all mean something specific. You know, when we get into this part, depending on what kind of information you can find on that statistical model, this is a part where you might say, ooh, I don't understand everything that's going on here, but I get the idea, and just move on, and that would be totally acceptable. They give you their questions on their survey here. And then finally, they're going to go into the discussion. So in their discussion, they present their findings, and then they also identify the limitations, which is great. They acknowledge the faults in the study or the flaws, and then barriers. So these researchers are going out of their way to point out their faults, which is very hard for people to do. So we want to acknowledge that, and it's a good sign for this article. Now this article has a discussion section and a conclusion section. Sometimes it does happen. Generally, the conclusion section is where they're going to talk about future research or talk about what they want to do in the future. Here they talk about how after they did their initial pilot program that they expanded it. So finally, we have an acknowledgement section. This is a good place to research as well. You know, some of these people might be really influential, but without researching that, we would never know that. So this article, they give you key points. Not every article will do that. It's pretty rare, actually. And then finally, we're into the reference section. This is where all that literature review, you can come and find the entire article. And if you are writing a paper, let's say on animal therapy, and you need more resources, and you're like, this is a great article, I need more articles like this, you can just mine the reference section, because the researchers have done all the work for you, and all of these articles are going to be related to this one, so you know that you're actually going to find something useful for you with very minimal work. And you know, you've got the years here, so you can even make sure that you're finding current information. It's a really great place to find extra sources. So, any questions at all? We're kind of at the end here, or is there anything that you want to see?
No, I think it's been pretty informative.
Okay, great. Did it help you out at all? Or I know you missed some of it.
No, it did.
And then let me show you one more thing. We have I think it's on the website. Pretty sure it is. Let me look. We'll go here. Just make sure it's there real quick. Okay, so on the college homepage, if you click on video tutorials, and then virtual research workshop recordings. This PDF right here, how to read and understand a research article. This presentation was heavily based on this person's article, and this is a great overview, just a really nice summary of everything we kind of went over. So I definitely recommend going to the website and saving this article for later reference and keeping it with you when you go through reading one of these articles. So.
Okay, cool.
Awesome. Well, did you have any, I'm going to stop the recording here real quick. Hold on.